Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Terra Prime Live Sword Lab Online. So we are here again with another Sword Lab class. Again, joining me is Ben Judkins, Ben Chosun, as he's known in the circles. How you doing, Ben?
Excellent. How you doing, Chad?
Very good. Okay. So we are kind of up in the air. We're here in Michigan. We're starting to open back up. So I've been at the club all day, kind of getting everything set. The inspector for the pool came today, and we're getting all there. So some light fare for today. I wanted to go through a couple of little techniques for people. And especially people who were doing some of the classes that we've done this past couple of weeks, but kind of expand it into a place that I don't think we've gone yet, with Wudong Jian, or sword. And then we can talk about some various things that have been happening in the community or what have you, as it were. I know there's a new sword out that we wanted to say something here. Okay, so what do we got here? Yes. Greetings from Puerto Rico. Welcome. Good to see y'all. Okay, so now I don't know. I'll be putting out a couple of videos that have dealt with this, but we've dealt with these kind of things before, because they kind of intersect with the lightsaber thing, which is essentially these characters that are associated with swordplay. We start out with 4, we then expand it into 13, and we've talked about most of those before. For the mother techniques, which are the 4, which are the strike, stab, or sting. Strike, sting, parry, or block, and wash or deflect. So that's those 4, and then Li Jinglin expanded those into 13. The 13 are Cho, to draw, Dai, to carry or to lead. It's a very strange word because it has to do it deals a little more horizontally. It's also a belt of some sort. But anyway, Ki, to lift, Ge, Ji, and Si, which are all both of the mother techniques, and then Dian, Bong, Jiao, Ya, Pi, Jie, and Xi, which is again part of that. These things like dot, Dian, Jiao, to stir, Ya, press down, Pi, chop, very, very common. A lot of them are used by multiple systems. Now,
about that, Chad.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So when we're talking about the vocabulary here, and we've got our 13 terms, right?
Yes.
Now, obviously, those come down to us from works that are being written in, lessons that are being put together in the 1920s and 30s, right? Mm-hmm. When you go back and you do your translation of things from the Ming Dynasty, is there any sense that those 13 techniques are existing as a set? Do we see those same names? Or do we think that this is more of a modern way of understanding fencing if you're Chinese?
I would say it's probably more of a modern thing. In the Ming Dynasty, first of all, there's not a lot written on Jian. There's Chao Xian Shifa, and that's the only one I'm familiar with. Some stuff on Tao, some stuff on all that kind of stuff. Most of it's on spear and that kind of thing. But they use sort of different terms prior Ming Dynasty and before, because also included in the Wu Bezhi is the sword songs from is it King Yu?
Yeah.
Can't remember who. Yeah, so it has these sword songs which mention different things. Now, one thing that is written that is mentioned as far back as the Yu documents is the Wanhua, the wrist flower. So that's interesting, right? That spinning seems to go way back, way back. That's assuming that wrist flower means the same thing. We never know how these things. However, that seems to be probably a pretty. I mean,
Pretty sure bet with that one.
it seems like it. It doesn't seem to have changed much. But say something like we were talking about Tiao, which is contrasted with Tian in the old things, right? So you have Tian, which is kind of like a tag with the true edge, and then Tiao, which is a tag with the false edge. And that turns into Dian. It's still Dian in the 13, but then Tiao is represented as Bong, right? Which is the, I know it as collapse, other people know it as to pop up or to rupture or something like that. The way I think of it, and the way that it was explained to me by a couple of my teachers, is that Bong is like if you have a building, when it collapses, right, the inside goes in, the outside goes out, and the top kind of flips up like that. And that's the kind of feeling like when you're kind of going down, right? And that was often contrasted to me with T, to lift, right? So you had these basic things of like collapsing down into something, like chopping down, letting gravity kind of help you, right? And then you had the other, which is rising up and lifting something and letting gravity pulling the target down help you. If that makes any sense. Like I said, and you know this, when you're learning these arts, a lot of times the teachers are, purposefully vague, and they send you on goose chases for whatever reason. Either they can't remember, and they're trying to buy time. Like, I'll give you this little tale. Let you work on that while I think about that for a second.
Or with some of the names, they're just metaphors. I mean, metaphors are really only useful if they can be squished around.
Yes.
I mean, metaphors aren't definitions.
Correct. Yeah, and that's the thing. All of these terms, if you really think about it, are metaphors. With the exception, I would say, of like Ji, which seems pretty straightforward. Okay, maybe just Ji. Everything else does, because like ge can mean a boundary or or a fortification, right? Or a frame, right? So it's like, But again, you have linguistic drift that happens even amongst like schools now, right? And that's where like where I wanted to get today from the 13 is in my lineage, which is from Li Tianji, who wrote this book. Fairly famous guy. I don't know if you can see that. Big exponent of Wu Dongjian, a student of Li Jingmin. And his uncle also was somebody, and I can't find his name right now, but whatever. Anywho, he has also some supplemental techniques, which are also kind of common ideas with the sword. Some of these can be like very similar, if not identical, to other techniques. Many of them can be applied in multiple ways. So he kind of keeps them together. Basically, let me see where he. Yeah, so the 13 techniques basically make up the core of Udon Jian, right? But as you go through it, they used to have the 5 methods and the 8 trigrams and all of these things. So there's all these kind of like leftover characters. Now, where they're left over from, I'm not exactly sure. He doesn't really say.
That's the interesting question right there, right?
Right, exactly. Because again, like as I say, the older you go, like the further you go back, the less characters you get, right? So, like with Li Tianji, you have the 13, which includes the 4, but then he has how many here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. He's got 10 supplemental techniques in addition to the 13.
So what do we think of Daniel's theory that we heard the other night, that originally whatever comes out of Wudang Mountain has 23 to 26 techniques, and then as Li Jingli and his buddies, who are all Tai Chi reformers and important experts, as they're getting together and talking, they're like, 13 basic techniques in Tai Chi, we should have 13 basic techniques in sword too, right? And so they try to converge on a standard, and so they canonize 13 of the techniques, and the rest are left as supplemental material.
I mean, yes, to an extent. I think that's kind of what happened, that you had maybe a bunch of techniques. What I think happened as far as Li Tianji goes, and probably Li Jingling to a lesser extent as well, is as they've met and studied with more people, everybody has these, like we said, they're metaphors. So it's just, just these teachers' ideas of how am I going to get this particular concept across to the student, right? And they pick up these things over time, right? And start to consolidate them. Because again, once you get to Song Wei Yi, right, at the beginning of the 20th century, it's 4. It's just it's the same 4 that's in Shaochen Shifa. So from 1641 to 1920 some, they didn't add any characters, in that kind of thing. And again, it's probably more to do with the way that they were approaching this. I think, and I think Daniel might have mentioned this, that in the past it's probably more practical, right? So it's more practical to have 4 categories in which you can put a whole bunch of whatever words you want in there, and just associate with one of those, right? And actually that brings us to these supplemental techniques, because a lot of these supplemental techniques will fall into multiple categories, right? They're not one or the other. And while that is, that can be true, a lot of them, it's especially true here. And I think that might have to do with their kind of like non-canonization. So there's kind of more, more to do with it. One little word about the idea of secret styles, because there's people who will say that, oh, well, this is the secret Yang style or whatever, and that we have all these different sets of characters. I don't know if I would call them secret. They're different. Every school may have a different set of their, of characters that they use. But anyway, we'll kind of leave that discussion.
But at the end of the day, there's only so many ways you can move the sword, kind of.
Pretty much, yeah. And the interesting thing is that what people call Tai Chi sword is more than likely just Wudong Jian. In fact, my teacher knew Sun Jianyun, and I've heard her refer to the Yang Taiji sword form as Chen Wei Ming's form, because he put the book out with that form in it.
Right.
Anyway, I'm not gonna, again, that's not something that I can answer right now. But anyway, so like I said, the first four are like categories, right? And then when you get into the 13, it starts to become more, kind of more solid, as far as like more direct to a movement, right? Although even Li Tianji still used the four mother techniques as categories, and put this other stuff in here. But anyway, I'll demonstrate here a couple of them, and then we'll move on. Okay, so I'll start with this guy here so we can see the blade. Because if I use the steel one, you won't see the blade, or whatever. But Yao is our first technique, right? And if I'm here, it's this kind of motion here, okay? It's unclear whether it's pretty much both of these will be Lao. So when I go up here like this, I go here like this. Now this means to kind of lift up, and these little nuances to the Chinese language are sort of important in this particular sense to figure out exactly what they're trying to impart. Because we'll talk about another character comes here, tuo, which means to support by the hand, right? And that can often look exactly the same as yao. So yao, meaning to lift up here, we're going to try to focus the effort on the end right here. So point of percussion and forward like this. Almost like if, we'll do a little cleaner example. You've got a curtain and you're trying to lift it up with the tip of the sword, right? To be contrasted with cho, where you're drawing up like this. I don't know if this difference is clear. So this would be cho here now. Right? See, so I'm up here like this. That means I have to kind of squeeze here. Now, the interesting thing with holding the sword, how do you have to have a variable grip, right? You're not going to hold it in one spot, and this is the reason why. When I'm going up this way here with Yao, my palm will not necessarily be touching my hand or my handle, right? It'll be here like this, because where I need the effort is up here, okay? Because it's going to be here. What's going to happen is this is going to pop up here, but I don't want that, okay? So I'm going to hold it here. Now, when we get to tuo, and this is the thing, then I am going to have my palm against that. And this, again, it's a very similar motion to Liao. That way, it only goes here, and I have to have my palm here, because what I'm doing is I'm focusing this effort in the palm, okay? Now, the reason why, we'll just talk about those two characters, right? So we've got tuo and Liao. Okay? Yao. There, Yao. And then tuo. Now, notice the whole weapon kind of moves together, but I can also move forward and backward a little bit. So if I go up here like this can be tuo. right? If I go up like this, when we get into binds, binds are very, Tuo is very good in the bind because we make contact with the opponent's blade and then we push in, lift them up to expose their lower doors, right? That's Tuo. Okay? We're acting on the weapon, not the person. We could be acting on the person, right? If my blade is crossing both of their forearms and I push up like that, it's a rare person who's not going to move up against that, right? They're not going to be very inclined to push against a sharp blade, even if they have lots of clothing, right? So there's that. Oh, there. Oh, we got somebody. We had somebody waiting.
Maybe they'll come back.
Maybe they will come back. Okay. Well, anyway. So anyway, yeah.
Chad, can we think of then the difference between those two characters, as in one we're sliding across the edge, and in the other one the force is kind of at a single point on the sword where we meet it?
I wouldn't say that would be the difference between Tuo and Yao. Yao is you're not necessarily doing sliding. That would be the difference between, I would say, Chou and Yao, at least in the way I am interpreting it and the way my school teaches it, right? Mm-hmm. So, and like I said, that could be different. Other people could be interpreting these characters a little bit different, mm-hmm. right? But for my money, this is almost like slicing. Yao is almost like slicing with this stuff right here. So yeah, you could move a little bit down here like that, but its connection, and we'll get into this here in a second, is not necessarily doing this, right? But it's doing this. It's another Ming Dynasty term, which is not used often here and is rather replaced by things like Liao and stuff like that, is Jian, to shear, right? To shear off. So this is based, like when I'm going here, I'm not necessarily trying to go into you and, right? That would definitely be more Tuo, right? But I might be going to the side of you, right? Try to clip your elbow, or make some of those little, offensive cuts. Mm-hmm. There to distract you, to open you up for a larger, killing blow. Mm-hmm. Right. Which also is another character from Ming Dynasty called Sha, right? Which just means to kill or to attack, right? But they would often say you do this, 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 and then Sha. So the idea of second and first, second, first, third intention, even though it's not explicitly stated, existed, at least that far back. Mm-hmm. Right. But as you can see, that's a little different. Like, so Liao can fit as Xi. Mm-hmm. It can fit as Ji, mm-hmm. right? Depending on how you hit, right? And Ge, right? Because you can easily intercept, or just block up one of those things.
All right, but martial artists are men of action, right?
Right.
So why do they need this kind of technical vocabulary, right? What do you get by teaching this to your students? Or let's say if you're, doing a lightsaber system, we've got Makashi students, right? Uh-huh. The lightsaber system has its own set of basics. What can they get by kind of delving into these classifications of movements?
Well, like I was saying with Tuo and Liao, right? Where I'm holding it and where the force is going through there, right? There's a lot to this. Okay. One of the reasons that this is a difficult weapon to master is because its length and its edge are the only mechanical advantages that you really have with it. right? Everything else you have to kind of manipulate to get to work. So you have to put the edge where it needs to be and all that. Whereas with a saber, it's usually a lot easier, right? Which is the reason they invented them. But so like that very difference, that there's a difference in the way that you're going to hit and engage and stuff like that. It's true though. A lot of people don't have any use for this kind of thing, right? If you're just a competitor, right, maybe having this amount of fidelity in what you're doing is not necessarily needed, but it's basically knowledge of what you are doing, right? You will be doing these things whether you know these words or not. No matter what you call them, you'll be doing these things because these are the things that happen in sword play and in sword fight, right? And it's how you can maximize a weapon of similar shape to this and there. Now, the minimal guard is one thing to think about. And so with all of these things, we're really moving our whole hand around and all
that. I wonder if even for a very practical person, right? Let's say, I'm a HEMA competitor or whatever, right? It's what I do. Even as a very practical person, these vocabularies might be really helpful tactically, just from the point of view of pattern recognition.
Yes.
That I want, when someone does something 2 or 3 times, even if it's not the same movement, I want to be able to pick up patterns of intention or action in my opponent. Or heck, when I'm training, I want to be able to pick up patterns of intention and action in myself.
Right.
Right. And it's really hard to do that if we only have 4 words. Right. The better our technical vocabulary is, it doesn't just help us talk about things. I think it kind of helps us see things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, characters like Tiao and Jian, which were common in the Ming Dynasty texts that I've seen, and not just with sword, with other weapons as well, right? And it has to do with interacting with the weapon and with the opponent, right? So, and with the target.
Mm-hmm.
So whereas I think modern people, at least when I was learning back in the 90s, because nobody was really fighting, nobody really fought in Chinese martial arts circles and stuff like that. So you got a lot of stuff that people just kind of extrapolated but didn't really get as being that practical because they weren't using it. They couldn't see any of it, so I don't know. It's if you can, okay, so let's take Jian, the character Jian. It means to shear, but it also is the word for scissors, right? And that's what gives you that clue, right? This action with the scissors,
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. When you then take that, and whenever you see that term, you kind of think of that action, and you think of, if it's a picture or it's describing something or something like that, these images start to come up. It just so happens that they're very similar to stuff that you see in like German longsword and stuff like that, or other forms of swordplay. So I would say, your imagination, coming up with some interpretation of it, and then when you cross-check that interpretation, if you find it in other sources called different things, but you find that same thing, you're on the right track, right? It's something that other people have noticed. So, the other thing is, well, let's take your metaphor idea. So, okay, with Tuo and Liao, and there's other ones like Gua, to hang, right? Where it's very much like and all that kind of stuff. But you're not necessarily going to just do it, when you're supporting with the palm, right? You can do it in other ways. You can do it with your hand, but again, it's that lifting up with there, but when you get into the metaphorical stuff like yin, that's probably at least a Ming Dynasty thing, I think, because it's definitely in the Ming Dynasty texts.
Mm.
Yun is when things go past your face, right? Now, yin means cloud. It also means to obscure. And there's two related. I'm not really sure on the history of the characters. I'll have to ask around. But there are two ways to kind of write it. One of them turned into the simplified version, but it might have different connotations to Ming Dynasty writers. I'm not sure. So, but yeah. But right, yeah.
So then if I wanted to practice this, right, and I have a set in front of me, I mean, it seems that most sets don't actually use these terms directly, right? So I take my Tai Chi sword set, I take my Makashi, and as I'm doing it, I'm trying to find these motions, right?
Yeah.
It's a way for me to categorize and identify what I'm doing as I am, analyzing motion.
Right. Yep. Yeah. And that's what we do when we're doing our sets, that kind of thing. So yes.
I mean, that's actually kind of interesting though, because one of the main questions that students at a certain level have is, what is this used for? Or, what would applications of this be? Right. And if you can do that, right, if you can, take some of these more complex movements apart and begin to classify them, well, you can suddenly generate lots and lots of possible applications, right? As soon as you identify what the movement is.
Yep. And I think one thing too, you mentioned earlier, that gets muddled is that in modern practice, weapons and barehanded techniques are practiced together. That was not the case prior to the 20th century. Usually weapons were trained as the weapon, right? At least in a military sense. Obviously anything can happen at the folk level, all kinds of stuff. One of these days we have to look into this. We have to do a piece on the short-lived idea that went through modern wushu of using everyday objects.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I saw someone reposted this set I've seen before. It looks like a guy is doing a taolu with with an ice saw. Like you would collect ice off of a frozen river with it. I mean, the thing looks scary as all get out, but I'm looking at it and it's like, wow, I mean, that's a hell of an idea. Let's take an ice saw out there and see what I can do with a bath lift style.
Oh my God, yeah. Oh, and there are supposedly, and I haven't seen any footage of this, but I heard from both Yu Chenghui and oh God, the Mantis guy.
Distinguished master to be named later.
Yes, when it leaves my freaking brain, I cannot believe I cannot remember his name. Anyway, he did the Mantis set. He's the bald monk in they're all bald. The Mantis monk in Shaolin Temple.
Okay.
Anyway. I don't even. What did I start out with that?
So
What
strange sets with everyday objects that are
Right, right. Yes, yes. These crazy things. They both said that they were doing things with like frying pans and 2x4s and dinner spoons and all kinds of crazy stuff. Right? Stools, chairs.
well, stools are huge. I don't know about the north, but in southern kung fu, everybody has got a stool set. You must you must have a stool set.
Yes. Or a bench.
Yeah, yeah, that bench with the legs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Now, how long? Well, here's a little question that I'll ask you because you're more versed in the southern arts than I,
Mm-hmm.
or than most. Uh, how long ago does that bench thing go? Is it more of a modern addition, or was it something that was?
I don't know because, of course, my background is in Wing Chun, and the entire point of Wing Chun is not to multiply things for Christ's
Right.
sake, to keep it to the bare minimum. But I'm going to assume it's at least early 20th century. When you see
Yeah.
it go up in, yeah, and like Trailerfoot and like all these other places where it is. That's when they're accumulating their big collections of sets. Um,
Right. Yeah.
and that's not a very modern type of bench or stool, right? Because it's always the same one. Like, you don't see anyone like out with a folding chair. No one's tried to modernize the set, right? you know
Right. Right.
and so we know from just kind of looking at photographs, those things were a big deal in like up through the 1910s, 1920s. You stop kind of seeing them in photos after that. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Yeah. There are of course legends of weapons that were used to be ordinary tools, right? Hoes and oars and
Yes, the classic boat oar.
yeah, you're right, exactly. You know, but this is different. This is like they're like using unaltered stuff that they just grabbed, like evidently. It was short lived. They all said it was really kind of fun, and it gave them a lot of creative license to do.
Well, I think that this happened in at least a couple of different veins, right? So it's like the benches and like this old grainy footage of the dude with the ice saw. That was
You high.
you high.
Thank
Right.
you.
Okay, there we go. That was like,
Oh
yeah,
my god. Yeah.
that was early 20th century.
Yeah.
But I remember reading kind of a propaganda article about the Chinese martial arts in a magazine called China Reconstructs, which is a straight up propaganda organ for the Communist Party from about the 1950s to the 1990s. So they would publish this English language magazine about what was going on in China. And, they'd send it to university libraries in the United States. And people mostly ignored it. But I was doing a literature review on it, looking for all of their articles about martial arts to kind of see how the government was framing and portraying martial arts. And during the Cultural Revolution, they had an article where they mentioned that, sets were being redone. So rather than these old feudalistic weapons, the proletariat could grab their pickaxe if they were a miner, or their hoe if they were a farmer, or, kind of whatever good worker implement you had around, you could do your kung fu with that, and that was just a straight up kind of ideological argument. So I wonder if that's what these guys, if they were kind of remarking on that period of time in which we were like bringing kung fu back to the workers, sort of a deal.
Maybe that was the idea, but from what I heard, they were not talking about pickaxes. They were not talking about implements, which can be usually used as weapons.
Oh yeah.
Literally, Yu Hai was talking about a frying pan set.
Well, that's awesome because, I've seen Tangled or whatever that Disney movie was. So I believe in the power of the cast iron, right?
Oh my God, no. If anybody has ever felt one of those cast iron skillets, my God, if I am sure if you look in the Old West, there were plenty of husbands that got killed by cast iron skillets.
Yeah.
You know, boom. You know, it just, oh man, they're mean. But anyway, it would be an interesting little thing to dig up. I don't know if there's any footage or pictures or anything of that. You know, ladders too. Ladders. I wanted to see a ladder set.
Absolutely. Right? Yeah.
You get hurt on a ladder so easy. Weaponize that thing, right?
All right, that would be good.
Yes. All right. Yes. Okay. So we've got some movement on the chat here. The lore of Okinawa Kabuto is that those weapons were everyday gardening tools. Yes. Yes. That is the lore. He said. Xander says, but the first Okinawan King show abolished weapons before that. Yes.
So I got to point out that lore is hard to nail down. You look at, like, the nunchuck. Is it a rice flail? Is it horse bits? I mean,
and remember, it's a weapon in China as far back as the Song, right? So it's not like they didn't have flails, and it's not like they didn't have flail. They call them two-section staff.
Yeah.
You know, and the Chinese ones, like the handle tends to be a little longer than the flail part.
Yeah.
Just by a little bit.
Often because they were used mounted, right? Guys on horseback, guys on walls. So
the long flails. The long flails are definitely a cavalry weapon, and I cannot imagine how mean that would have been. With those things, because they'll like half wrap around your head and drag you a little bit. But yeah, so that's the thing. The nunchucks. Oh yeah, those are rice flails, maybe, but they're also actual flails,
right?
And so which
where do we go with that?
I mean, it's an interesting tangent to go on, even though we started with like really traditional sword play, right? And we've kind of morphed into this weird.
Should we bring it back to really traditional swords?
I don't. Maybe not. I mean, I think one thing though. Let's mix it.
All right.
Right. So let's take sword play. What good is learning the Jian in modern day age? You're talking about that, right?
Right.
Because we don't fight with these anymore. They're not. If you're walking around with one of these, you're probably going to be stopped. At least.
Why I bring my lightsaber to the park.
Right, exactly.
I'm much less likely to get hassled by the cops with my lightsaber than if I bring a metal sword to the park.
Right, exactly. So, but are there useful things to be done here? Well, first of all, because any stick that is about this long, you'll be able to do any kind of sword technique with. So there you go. If you have, let's take the two things we were talking about today. Now, cool. And I don't have my stick down here, but here you can do that with a stick, right? You also have the ability to sort of flip it around like that. But one thing that I think it's been unstated a lot of times, but is often seen in like Hong Kong movies and stuff like that, is these are very much like an umbrella, right? If you hold an umbrella, you can do a lot of the things that you can do with this thing with an umbrella. Mm-hmm. If you wanted to, you could fortify that middle shaft, right? And put a tip at there, and you now have a pretty deadly weapon.
Exactly.
Because remember, small swords weren't even sharp.
Yeah.
They were just a thrusting weapon.
They're just pointy.
Right.
Pointy.
Now, if you could do umbrella for self-defense because you could just keep the tip real small. So it's just like poking them and they're like, ah. You're not going to run them through or anything like that.
Well, if we want to go Hong Kong theater on this, though, the other place you see a lot of those Jian techniques is in the feather duster.
The feather duster, yep.
So, that long, thin stick with, just crappy feathers. I don't think they're actually very good for dusting, but that is just a trope, right? Controlling your opponent with just that very narrow stick,
Yep, exactly. Yep, yeah, any little stick will do. And that's one of the reasons I like Gen technique is it does kind of translate that way because we make a ton of stuff with a handle, and anything that has a handle and it protrudes out like that.
Yeah.
Hey, I think we're in business.
Yeah, exactly. Having hands.
Right. So, okay, let's see here. Yes, Xander says, Sai, we're also always weapons too. Which, Sai sometimes are told that they're farming implements, but they weren't. Jite were used by Japanese police for a very long time, and they got them from the use of them in Chinese law enforcement and stuff like that.
And you actually see a fairly great variety of forms within China when they show up in the archaeological or museum record in China. They can look like a lot of things. They seem to have narrowed right down in Okinawa. But
yeah, yep, exactly. All right, let's see here. There are tactical umbrellas or self-defense umbrellas. So I guess there are umbrellas that will do that. Somebody else said toilet plunger. Why not?
Exactly.
I'm certain people will be very afraid if you hold that plunger out there.
Yeah.
Probably more afraid than a sharp sword or an umbrella. Like, whoa, get that thing away from me, man. And never underestimate that power either.
Yeah.
So there we go. A winding road, a little rambling thing. We gave you a couple of little techniques in there.
But before we go, we got to get back to old swords.
Okay. Yeah.
So in terms of what's going on in the sword world right now.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Right. One of my favorite swordsmiths, L.K. Chen, who's in Guangzhou. I don't know if you guys have been following him, but he makes reproductions of Han Dynasty and, up through about the Tang Dynasty, really old stuff. He's most famous for his reproductions of Han Dynasty Jian, but he just released a Tang Dynasty Dao, which looks absolutely gorgeous. And of course, this was the sword that was the forerunner of the Japanese katana. This is what went to Japan and then eventually kind of would reemerge as the katana. And he is selling this thing for, I think, $300 right now. And, I have reviewed one of his swords on my blog before. Chad, I just sent you the link there if you want to take a look at it.
Oh,
and,
cool.
For something in that price range, they're just stunningly well put together blades. I was really impressed with his Flying Phoenix. At some point, I am going to have to pick one of those up. But if you're more of a saber guy, or a Tang weapon aficionado, for $300 for a handmade sword, wow, this is an impressive piece of work.
It is indeed. Yeah, and the Tang Dynasty, like all that old stuff, I've always marveled. And once I started reading the Ming Dynasty military stuff, it started to click a little bit better for me because blades were already starting to go out of style, in military Ming Dynasty stuff. Qi Ji Guang, even though he's famous for spears and long sabers and all this other stuff, was all about the gunpowder.
Right. I mean, that's the thing. He's famous to us for boxing. To his
Right.
contemporaries, he was famous for firearms.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So take it for what it's worth. But the Tang Dynasty stuff and back, the Han Dynasty, the Tang Dynasty, all of these swords, to me, they seem to be far more well crafted and diverse than the ones you get kind of in later periods. Even though you do have some really amazing examples of more modern swords, some of the stuff coming out of the Tang Dynasty, Han Dynasty, and Sui, and all of that stuff are absolutely gorgeous. They experimented with pattern welding, what Damascus blades or whatever.
I mean, the Han Dynasty stuff, it's thin, it's light, it's flexible, it's strong. I mean, it's not what you think, it's a sword should look like right at the end of the Bronze Age. Oh my God, those guys tooled up their technology really, really fast. Western Han Dynasty, those swords are incredible.
Yeah. Now, I took a course way back when in art history about certain weapons and armament and stuff like that throughout history, as it related to art and stuff. But one of the things that professor says is that the Chinese Bronze Age was ridiculously short, and you can almost say it almost didn't occur, because while they were still using bronze weapons, they were making steel.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So steel and iron arrived on the scene in China very, very early on, and that's where I think you get these. They're really taking advantage of the qualities of steel. It can be thin, it can be light, it can be strong, it can be sharp. It will hold all of those qualities.
Incredibly flexible, just very, which is great in a sword. It's got to be springy. It's got to be able to flex and not take a set, right? And by the Han Dynasty, they've got that down. They have it down cold.
Yeah, the double fullers and all that kind of thing. I mean, they're really beautiful blades, and he's doing a really good job too, because he's using modern metals and modern metallurgy and a lot of modern techniques with the knowledge, the ancient knowledge as well, and all that kind of thing, and trying to reproduce them. And he's also thinking a lot about using them. Like these have to be usable weapons, because he's reproducing them from these eras. It makes no sense if you can't use them, because they were in the past.
But this is the challenge with his weapons, is he's making really accurate reproductions of some of these weapons, right? So he has a Gen. It's not the Dao that I was talking about. Let me see if I can get back and figure out what this Gen was called again. It's called the White Arc, right? And the White Arc, for instance, has this ridiculously long blade. I think the blade's like 35, 37 inches long or something like that. And it is a dedicated single-handed sword, right? And again, this is a direct replica. And you realize that, they're dealing with sword forms in the Han Dynasty that we don't have any analog for in later Chinese history. And I've seen people wield that sword. It doesn't make sense to me as a Chinese martial artist. It's like a single-handed rapier that can really cut stuff. But I mean, lots of room to experiment there. And, I guess the real question is, all right, given that most of our background comes out of the late Qing and the Republic period, how well suited are we to utilize, some of these more exotic designs?
Yeah, it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see. And that's kind of like TPLA. That's what we're kind of all about. Hopefully on future episodes of Sword Lab, we'll get other people. Like, I wish Jared would come in here. He could have maybe given us a little bit more detailed history about those Japanese evolutions of, at least even where that idea came from. A lot of these things are just complete myths, but then you're left with, well, where did the myth come from? How did that get started? Because like, I mean, there's some myths where you get to the reality of it, you're like, what?
That's way weirder.
Yeah, exactly. Well, huh? So like we were talking about the wrist cut last week.
Mhm.
all that kind of stuff. It's an odd thing, and if you don't know the context, or the possibility of having first blood duels and that kind of thing.
Mhm.
So, but that's funny. All right, we got one more question here. Once gunpowder came into vogue, the firearm became the military weapon. Swords became ceremonial accessories in fell favor for actual fighting. Actually, that is not true.
Another myth, a very
Gunpowder,
common one.
yeah, yeah, very common myth. There's a very good myth. Um, the I cannot turn off my stupid dinging. Sorry, I apologize for that. Anyway, gunpowder was invented and utilized in enormous effect in the Song Dynasty, right? Which is 900s, 7 to 900s, right? And swords and bladed weapons and melee weapons existed all the way into the 20th century. And it wasn't until the end of the Republic period, probably a little bit before, maybe the end of the Qing dynasty, that that firearms started to replace swords and all of that kind of stuff as being the ubiquitous weapon everywhere. Even though we've mentioned Qi Ji Guang was very all about gunpowder and all of that kind of thing. Again, Ming Dynasty, people still fought with swords. Qing Dynasty, still people fought with swords. Now, yes, these were civilian, right? But they still gave Dao to soldiers, right? They still had spearmen. They still had pole arms, all that kind of thing.
As near as we can tell, the modern martial arts, or the concept that there should be modern martial arts in a Chinese context, is born at the end of the Ming Dynasty.
Yeah.
Right. And so whether we're talking about martial arts with swords and spears, or kind of martial arts, unarmed martial arts, all of that stuff actually evolves in the age of gunpowder. Right.
Right.
I shouldn't say every, I should say big battles in the Ming Dynasty were typically won by guys with rifles already by that point. Again, this is what we're talking about. Ji Quan, the same guy who gives us Kung Fu, is at exactly the same time giving us the supremacy of gunpowder as the way that you get your ranged weapons going.
Right. Exactly. So it's interesting, that we have this idea that the gun will like as soon as the gun or gunpowder arrives on the scene, it just replaces it. Even in the Civil War, people still were issued military sabers, which were used in battle. Right? It wasn't until you get the repeaters and the Remingtons and stuff like that that you start getting the more. Because remember, up until that point, up until probably the 1800s, guns were more dangerous to their wielders than they were to the target, because they would usually blow up in your hand. Or I want to know all about all of the Song Dynasty accidents that happened with all of their gunpowder stores, because it happened.
Oh yeah, no, we have to have Peter Lorch on this show. We got to get Peter on here to talk to us about.
Exactly. Yeah, because that would be. I want that could be the source of a lot of weird dark comedy.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right, we're at the end of the hour here. We've good discussion, even though we didn't have much planned, but kind of worked out, I think. Thank you again, Ben, for joining me here.
My pleasure.
Yes, we'll try to get. We'll keep getting more and more people here to come in and talk with us and do stuff and all that kind of thing, even as we go on. We may be starting up classes again pretty soon, so stay tuned for that. Anyway, also, if you're on Facebook, go ahead and go to the page, Terra Prime Light Armory, like it if you have not already. We're running a June summer saber cyber school, where all of our instructors are doing half hour or so Facebook Live lessons on a variety of sabering topics and stuff like that for lightsaber. Check it out. You can see a little bit about the other people that are involved in this whole project. So anyway, I will leave you there. Have a great day. Have a good weekend. We've got Saber Academy tomorrow, so stay tuned for that. Until then, patience, practice, perseverance. Happy sabering.